Ask Reddit, what's the scariest experience you've ever been through? At about 10 years old, I fell through ice on a pond. When I came back up, I smacked into ice, instead of the hole I fell through. The water was too murky to see any light from the hole, and I thought that I was witnessing the end of my short life. I was lucky to find the opening again, but as I tried to get back up, the ice kept breaking and I'd go under again. The whole event probably lasted 30 seconds, but to me, it was a lifetime. It's been 35 years, and I'm still nervous on a frozen body of water, even if cars and trucks are driving on it. My son's brain surgery. He has epilepsy and had a small portion removed in 2020 to alleviate his seizures and give him a better quality of life. He spent a week with wires in his brain tracking his seizures as he had them in real time. They slowly stopped his anti-seizure meds to induce them. He had 26 in one night as he slept. Once it was enough data, they removed a portion of his brain near his speech and memory center. This was the location of his misfires. The general consensus was that he had a good chance of losing his speech and memory. His personality could disappear. After his surgery, as he was being taken back to his room, he raised his arm to touch his face. The physician told him not to, and my son said, "I'm not, I just want to touch it." He spoke before he was fully out of anesthesia. 3 days later, he was home. 3 days after that, he was being transported back for emergency surgery because of a nasty infection under his skull. The surgeon later said he was maybe 12 hours from dying if he hadn't been seen. He had no symptoms other than a growth strip. No pain, no fever, nothing. Another brain surgery and 6 weeks with a drain tube and monitor on him at home with nurse visits weekly. He is now seizure-free and on a much lower dose of meds than he was previously. 1,500 daily down to 100 milligrams. I spent a month in the children's center, helplessly watching my son slip in and out of consciousness and have hundreds of seizures. The possibility of him waking up with no memories and no way to speak was horrifying to me as his father. So the scariest moment in my life, and keep in mind I've been shot, stabbed, and beaten, was almost losing my 16-year-old child 3 times in 1 month. Kinda a humorous one. A few years ago, in the dead of night, my husband and I were woken up by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering at around 3 a.m. Naturally, we assumed that someone was breaking into our house. Our hearts were in our mouths. But we weren't going to split up, so we went downstairs together to check it out. I have never been so scared as when we had to go through our house, room by room, to make sure there wasn't an intruder. But there wasn't, and none of the windows were broken. We were super confused. Until we walked into the bathroom. Turns out, tempered glass shower doors have a reputation for randomly exploding. If a crack forms, it very slowly spreads across the rest of the glass, and when it crosses a certain threshold, the whole thing shatters. Ours just happened to be at 3 a.m. At a very secluded cabin. Look for fallen tree on left. Now there's a huge boulder. Drive into the bush. You'll reach small clearing in about 3 minutes. Now veer right at the 3 fallen trees. Kinda place. No electricity, no phone service, no people. Just me and my young daughter. Went into town for more supplies. As we drove through the bush and came into a clearing, there were 2 vehicles and 6 men. No way forward, no way back. They didn't wave or smile. 2 of them talked while watching us. One said something to the other men, and they moved their trucks to let us by. About a month later, I was contacted by police wanting a description of the men we'd seen. A body had been found nearby, and they suspected it was a drug deal gone wrong. Tick-borne encephalitis. I didn't even know a tick had bitten me, and went from headache to shivers and extreme fever until I wasn't able to walk without my wife supporting me. Even reading made my head spin like crazy, and I didn't know what the reason was. I was chased through the woods by a stranger with a bat. He seemed hell-bent on beating my brains in. I jumped in a river, held my breath, and sunk to the bottom. I let the current of the river take me as far as I could until I needed another breath of air. When I came up, I couldn't see him anymore, crossed the river and hid in the woods until it got dark and hiked home. Finding out my best friend has attempted ending herself and not knowing whether or not she was going to survive. I remember letting her boyfriend know she was in the hospital and how helpless we both were. Okay, so this isn't as bad as some others, but here goes. When I was around 7 years old, I got a Furby for Christmas. At the time I was ecstatic as I really wanted one. Now Furbies have their own language, which, one of the words they said sounded suspiciously like my name. My Furby couldn't be turned off save for taking out the batteries, which required a tiny screwdriver that we either didn't have or 7-year-old me couldn't find. Furbies tend to talk whenever they feel like. So I shoved my Furby in my closet and the battery started to die. With the diminishing battery life, the Furby started to have a less than friendly sound. One night, at around 3 a.m., I wake up to the demonic sound of my low battery Furby saying my Fing name. Terrified 7-year-old me evicted Furby the next morning. My wife went past her due date, so her doctor decided to induce the pregnancy. It did not go well. After a dozen hours of no progress, the hospital told us that if we didn't do an emergency C-section, our son would likely die. The whole thing was a blur. I barely remember going to the operating room. My feet were like lead the whole time. Outwardly, I was keeping it together, but inside it was sheer panic. Thankfully, we were at a top-notch hospital and the C-section went great. However, when we got to the postpartum room, it was pretty clear something was wrong with my son. When babies are born, they kind of look like little old prune men and not chunky Stay Puft marshmallows. So you can imagine the concern we had when we see his ribcage outlines every time he gasps for breath while pumping his tiny little chest in and out. We alerted the nurse and she went to the center station to figure out what to do. I overheard her, from inside our room, emphatically telling the doctor on call that he needed to be moved to the NICU ASAP. You know, in movies when a character experiences a moment of panic? Time slows down, noise becomes garbled, and they just kind of drift? That happened to me. The nurse pulled me out of the room and explained what was going to happen, and I am just trying to keep it together as I listen. They informed me that because my wife was still recuperating, she would not be able to go up into the NICU yet, so it was just me, at like 3 o'clock in the morning, having to endure them putting needles and IVs into this tiny little life we had made. He ended up being fine, just a little extra fluid in his lungs, and we were out in 4 days, which is nothing compared to many of the parents in a NICU. This was, and still is, the scariest experience of my life. Got stabbed in the stomach. Like square in the center of my abdomen. I didn't even feel it thanks to all the adrenaline. I ended up in the hospital, gripping the bed while a nurse put a finger into the stab wound in the center of my abdomen. I had been drinking, of course, so I wasn't on any pain medication. But fuck if I didn't sober up quickly. Everything hurts less when I think of that pain. I'll preface this part with the fact I'm a pretty thin dude, so when I lie down my stomach kinda goes inward a bit. So they go to apply the bandages again, and my stomach made like a little bowl for the blood, and they wiped the blood off and I could hear it splash onto the floor. I remember a nurse said something about needing to get the bleeding under control in what sounded like a panicked tone. That was the moment I fully realized I might not end up being okay. Ended up having surgery to make sure my intestines were not punctured. They weren't. Was discharged the next day. Had pain walking for about a week and was back to normal after 2 weeks. My husband got caught in a riptide and was quickly pulled away from shore while I watched in terror. We were on a private beach and he is not a great swimmer, and once he disappeared I was sure he would drown. Luckily, he was fine and managed to get out of it and let the waves carry him to shore. I say luckily, because while someone did call 911, the response was cops without a boat or sea-doo or anything to go out and find him. Worst moments of my life, had PTSD for a few years after that. I was in a hospital for months because of something else, couldn't get up and had already lost a ton of weight, which made me severely underweight. Then caught some kind of virus, the doctors couldn't figure out what it was, and got weaker every day. I couldn't eat or drink and vomited all the time. At some point what I spat out was entirely black, probably dried blood. I can hardly remember that time of my life, but looking in the mirror and seeing my bloodshot eyes where all the veins popped and my chin and neck with burns from the acidity in stomach fluid and my skinny arms and ribs was horrifying. I think I was around 14 at the time and was sure I'd die. It went on for days and then just stopped. We thought it was that hospital virus that happens sometimes, but apparently it wasn't. Still don't know what happened and how I survived. Mother yanking the steering wheel of the car while I was driving on the freeway. I was brand new to driving and hadn't yet gotten my license. I had a permit that allowed me to drive as long as I had a designated driver in the passenger seat. We were on the freeway and she was directing me towards the exit. She told me to get off on the next, right, so I did. She suddenly screamed at the top of her lungs, "No. Not this exit," and she grabbed the bottom of the steering wheel and pulled. She was trying to make the car turn left. She didn't pull it hard enough to flip us, but she did pull it hard enough to swerve us almost immediately right back into traffic. We were going at least 60 miles an hour. I managed to slam on the brakes and right the steering wheel to keep us from crashing. By some miracle, the car behind us managed to slam on the brakes and swerve around us so we weren't in an accident. Mom then proceeded to yell at me for having a panic attack, screaming, "You don't stop in the middle of the freeway, go go go." She refused to let me pull over and then complained about my erratic driving for the next half an hour, while I went through a literal panic attack. One of the scariest moments of my life, and I still have trouble driving to this day due to PTSD. I cannot go on freeways. I've been through many, but one time I was actually minutes from death. I got some sort of stomach flu years ago where I couldn't keep anything down for over a week. My husband was working odd double shifts in law enforcement at the time and I couldn't really call him. I was home with my kids on day 10 of this nightmare of sitting on the toilet with a trash can on my lap at the same time. I put the kids to bed somehow and was in the bathroom when I blacked out. I woke up hours later in the middle of the night to my husband shaking me and screaming at me. My mother-in-law came to watch the kids and my husband brought me to the ER. The nurses were trying to find a vein to insert the 4-needle into, but they were collapsed. I remember sitting there and started getting tunnel vision and started to feel weightless like I wasn't in my body. My husband said that the nurse was explaining that she would have to stick the needle in my eye if she couldn't find a vein, and I reached up, pulled down my lower eyelid and just stared at her. She decided to try my arm one last time and got the needle in a vein. My body sucked 2 bags dry in a few minutes and it was so crazy. As the fluid filled my veins, it was like I came back to life. I absolutely am aware now about how fragile life is. I also finally understood the gravity of dying from dysentery on the Oregon Trail, LOL. I've talked about this here before, albeit not in a top-level comment. Scariest thing ever was waking up in an ICU bed with a vent tube in my throat and no idea what had become of my babies. The day they were born, I woke up, got out of bed, and looked down to see blood running onto the floor. Assumed placental abruption, a premature separation of that organ that can lead to stillbirth. So I got transported to the hospital on the double. Side note, being in an ambulance and hearing them flip on the sirens to not wait at the red light is pretty fucking scary on its own. Shoved into an ER room that was already occupied where they did an ultrasound and told me both babies had heartbeats, and thence taken to an OR. I knew I was gonna be knocked out for the C-section, but I did not in any way expect the whole ICU bit. Turns out I was in surgery for 10 hours, had the entirety of my blood volume replaced, and lost several bits and bobs to placenta accreta, in which the placenta grows through the uterine wall and can grow into the bladder in extreme cases. So, all of that was awful and traumatic, but for some reason no one updated me on my babies. I've looked at the OR notes. I know their 5-minute APGARs were good and they were taken to the NICU in stable condition. So that wasn't a factor. I can only imagine they were just that unused to maternity patients and didn't think to update me. And with the ventilator, I could not speak, and no one thought to offer a notepad or any other means of communication. And, of course, I was loopy as F on pain meds and the sedation they kept turning back up because I was so agitated. Thankfully, both babies were/are fine, but the hours that passed before the doctor who cheerfully told me I'd never need another pap smear thought to tell me they'd both made it will always be the worst of my life, and I have held another baby while she died. Thank you very much for watching. Take care and remember to stay hydrated, friend.